I stood in the back of a church one evening, lights bright, music polished, screens glowing like a concert. Everything looked alive, everything sounded confident, and yet inside me, something felt strangely hollow. I couldn't explain it at first. I just knew my spirit was unsettled, like a compass spinning when it can't find north. I had come expecting comfort, but what I felt instead was an ache, and at the same time, a whisper of nearness I couldn't ignore. Culture keeps telling us the church must be louder, younger, faster, more impressive to matter. It tells people like me that if we don't recognize what is happening anymore, then maybe we're the ones fading out. But standing there with my hands folded and my heart open, I realized something that startled me. Jesus didn't feel far. He felt close. Not in the noise, not in the polish, but in the ache itself. If you've ever sat in a pew and felt invisible, if you've ever wondered whether the church still has a place for your voice, your tears, your slower steps, stay with me because what I discovered challenged everything I thought I knew. Don't skip this, especially if the church has ever left you behind. Because that night I began to see something I had missed for years. I found only one type of church that truly belongs to Jesus. Later that night I was back home, standing alone in my kitchen. The house was quiet in that deep way only evening brings, when the world finally stops asking anything from you. A cup of tea sat beside my Bible, already cooling, a thin skin forming on the surface while I hadn't even taken a second sip. The light above the sink hummed softly, everything felt ordinary, and yet my chest felt heavy with years. I thought about all the services I had attended, all the committees I had served on, all the prayers I had whispered into hospital rooms, kitchens, cars, and empty bedrooms. I remembered seasons when church felt like oxygen, and others when it felt like I was holding my breath. I remembered people who had moved on, people who had gone home to the Lord, and prayers that still hadn't found an answer. I wasn't angry, I wasn't bitter, I was just tired in a way only someone who has loved deeply can be tired. I still loved the church, I still believed in fellowship, in worship, and gathering, but I missed Jesus, not the idea of him, not the language of him. I missed the nearness, the quiet weight of his presence, the way my soul used to recognize his voice without effort. I stood there with my hands resting on the counter, eyes on an open page, and I felt the words rise up without planning them. That night, I didn't ask God where the perfect church was. I asked him where he was. As I stood there, I felt something shift inside me. Not dramatically, not loudly, just enough to realize that maybe what I had been calling disappointment was actually preparation. Maybe the unease I felt wasn't a sign that I was drifting away from God, but that he was gently drawing me closer to what really mattered. For a long time, I had absorbed a quiet lie without noticing it. The lie that getting older meant becoming less spiritually useful, less relevant, less needed, as if wisdom has an expiration date, as if prayer weakens when the hair turns gray, as if Jesus prefers energy over endurance. But in that still kitchen, I sensed the opposite. I sensed that age doesn't blur spiritual vision. Often, it sharpens it. It strips away what is unnecessary. It teaches the heart to listen for what is true. I began to see the difference between noisy religion and quiet presence, between endless activity and simple obedience, between full rooms and full hearts. Crowds can gather anywhere. But compassion takes listening. Compassion takes time. Compassion takes the kind of seeing that only comes when you've lived long enough to know what pain sounds like when it isn't shouting. So if you've been feeling overlooked, if you've been wondering whether this season of your life still carries spiritual weight, I want you to hear this gently. You may not be drifting, you may be discerning. What I'm about to share didn't come from a stage, it came from a whisper. Not long ago, I met a woman named Margaret. She was 74, a widow, soft-spoken, with the kind of eyes that tell you she's lived through more than she ever talks about. She told me she had stopped going to church a few years earlier, not because she lost her faith, not because she was offended, but because she slowly began to feel unnecessary, like a chair pushed against the wall after the room had been rearranged. She said, "I still love Jesus. I just don't think he needs me anymore." Those words stayed with me. Margaret spent her Sundays alone, reading scripture quietly, humming old hymns to herself. Her faith never left, but her sense of belonging did. Until one afternoon, someone invited her to a small prayer gathering in a living room. No stage, no microphones, just a few folding chairs, a worn Bible on a coffee table, and people who weren't trying to impress anyone. She told me the moment that broke her open wasn't a sermon. It was when a young woman took her hand and said, "Would you pray for me?" Margaret's voice trembled when she described it. She said she felt Jesus closer in that small room than she had felt him in years. Not louder, closer, like he had been waiting quietly for her to sit down. Margaret didn't suddenly become busy. She became seen, and watching her, I learned something that has never left me. Jesus often lives where pride is absent and need is honest. If you feel comfortable, I'd love to know who I'm sitting with tonight. You can share your age and where you're watching from, not for numbers, but for connection, because none of us are meant to listen alone. It was after meeting people like Margaret that I began to notice a pattern, quietly at first, then unmistakably, and I realized I could describe it in 4 simple signs, not rules, not measurements, just gentle markers I've learned to watch for. 4 signs of the church that truly belongs to Jesus. The first is this: Jesus is the center, not the attraction. There is a difference. An attraction draws a crowd. A center holds a life. I have sat in spaces where everything pointed somewhere, toward talent, toward personalities, toward excellence, toward growth. None of those things are wrong, but somewhere along the way, Jesus had become the reason people came, without remaining the reason they stayed. He was talked about more than he was talked to, sung about more than waited on, referenced more than relied upon. And I don't say that as criticism. I say it as a confession, because I've been in those rooms, clapping, agreeing, participating, while my soul quietly starved for his nearness. But then I've sat in other places, sometimes only 2 or 3 people, sometimes in kitchens, sometimes in hospital rooms, sometimes beside a bed or at a small table. And in those places, Jesus wasn't the topic. He was the presence. People weren't performing. They were leaning. They weren't consuming. They were depending. For those of us who have lived long enough to outgrow religious trends, this sign matters. Because after years of doing, building, and serving, what we crave is not excitement. We crave reality. We crave to sit where Jesus is not being presented, but recognized. And the second sign is the one most people miss, and it changed how I recognize God's voice. I think of a man named Thomas. He was 81, a retired mechanic who had spent his whole life fixing what others couldn't: engines, tools, broken things. But when I met him, his own hands shook too much to hold a wrench, and his memory slipped just enough to embarrass him. He told me he had stopped going to most gatherings because he hated repeating himself, hated asking again, and hated feeling like the slowest person in the room. He said, "I used to be useful, now I just get in the way." Culture has a way of measuring worth by output, by speed, by how much someone can carry, produce, organize, or lead. And when those things fade, it quietly suggests that value fades with them. But Jesus has always moved in the opposite direction. Someone invited Thomas to a small prayer circle that met once a week. Nothing formal, no pressure, just scripture, silence, and shared prayer. Thomas almost didn't go. He told me he was afraid he'd forget what he was saying mid-sentence. Afraid his hands would shake when he tried to turn the pages. What he didn't expect was what happened when he bowed his head. His words were slow, sometimes broken, sometimes unfinished. But when he prayed, the room grew still. People leaned in, not because he was polished, but because he was honest. Thomas thought he had nothing left to offer. Yet he became the quiet anchor of that circle, not by teaching, by being. Watching him taught me something I can't unsee. Culture is drawn to strength. Jesus seems drawn to sincerity. And I wonder, have you ever felt like you didn't belong anymore? The second sign revealed itself slowly, through moments like the ones Thomas lived. Sign number 2, the broken are not managed, they are ministered to. There is a difference between helping people feel included and actually walking with them in their need. I've been in places where pain was acknowledged but quickly redirected, where sorrow was met with a schedule, where tears were offered a program. Again, not out of cruelty, but out of hurry. But wherever Jesus truly settles, hurry seems to leave. In the spaces that carry his nearness, weakness is not awkward. It is welcomed. Confusion is not rushed. It is listened to. The hurting are not guided back to their seats so the service can continue. They become the service. Compassion replaces structure. Patience replaces efficiency. Presence replaces performance. I have watched people sit beside hospital beds longer than the prayer itself lasted. I have seen scriptures read slowly, not for teaching, but for comfort. And in those moments, I didn't feel like I was attending church. I felt like I was standing on holy ground. Then came the third sign. Sign number 3, humility is more visible than talent. Talent draws attention. Humility creates room. I've been moved by gifted voices and skilled leadership, but I have been changed by quiet obedience. by people who don't need to be seen to serve, by hands that clean, hold right, and wait, by prayers spoken low enough that God is clearly the intended audience. Where Jesus is truly present, prayer outweighs performance. Burden-bearing outweighs branding. Listening outweighs explaining. People are not trying to build something impressive. They are trying to love someone faithfully. And I want to say this gently because I know many good people work in many institutions. This is not about condemning buildings, denominations, or gatherings. It is about discernment, about learning to recognize fruit instead of format, to ask not, does this look successful? But does this feel like Jesus? Because the fourth sign is the rarest of all, and it's where I finally understood what Jesus meant when he said, I am with them. There is another face I carry with me when I think about this, a woman named Eleanor. She was 69, and every part of her life revolved around caring for her husband, whose memory was slowly fading. She told me that most days he no longer remembered her name. Some days he didn't remember their life at all. She said she still believed in God, but she no longer felt him. Church had become impossible. Leaving the house was complicated. Sitting through a service felt distant and unreal compared to the long nights, the repeated questions, the quiet grief of watching someone you love slowly disappear. Eleanor told me, I feel like my faith is running on fumes. One afternoon, another woman stopped by with a small Bible and 2 cups of coffee. They sat at Eleanor's kitchen table. They didn't study. They didn't analyze. They read one psalm, slowly, then they prayed. Not beautifully, honestly. Eleanor said that was the first time in years she cried without apologizing. She told me later that was church, not because of the words, but because of the presence. Jesus met her there, not through a sermon, through shared tears, through quiet scripture, through someone willing to sit in the middle of her life and not try to fix it. Eleanor still spends most of her days unseen by the world, but I've never doubted the holiness of her faithfulness, because belonging is not about where you gather, it's about where love is carried, and dignity does not disappear when the work becomes hidden. Sometimes the truest sanctuary is a kitchen table. It was after walking through stories like these that the understanding finally settled in me. Not like a conclusion, like a homecoming. I realized the church that truly belongs to Jesus is not defined by location or size or structure. It is defined by posture, by who is being leaned on, by who is being listened for, by who is being loved through. And that is where the fourth sign became clear. Sign number 4, Jesus is recognized by his presence, not his packaging. Wherever hearts are surrendered, he is near. Wherever pride loosens its grip, he is felt. Wherever someone whispers his name not to perform, but to survive, he draws close. He does not announce himself with trends. He reveals himself with peace, not with spectacle, but with stillness. And as this truth settled in me, I began to sense something else, just as strongly. Many of us are standing in a very particular window of life, a season the world rarely celebrates, but heaven often uses. A time when the noise fades, when ambitions are quiet, when the soul becomes more honest about what it truly needs. There is a depth of authority in prayer that grows only after endurance. There is a clarity of spiritual hearing that often comes only after loss. Many of us are closer to Jesus than we've ever been, even if we feel farther from what we once knew. So if you felt displaced, if you've wondered where you fit now, I want to say this carefully, and I want to say it with hope. This may not be your ending. This may be your doorway. A doorway into a simpler faith, a deeper nearness, a church not built around you, but built within you. Right now, I want to pause and I want to pray. If you're able, I invite you to sit where you are, let your shoulders soften, and let these words become your own. Jesus, I come to you just as I am, not as I was, not as I think I should be, but as I am at this moment. I bring you my tiredness, I bring you my questions. I bring you the places where my faith feels thin and the places where my heart still aches. I release what I've been holding so tightly, the disappointments, the confusion, the quiet grief, and I place them back into your hands. Jesus, I don't want just information about you. I want your nearness. I want to recognize your voice again. I want to feel at home in your presence. If there are ways my heart has grown guarded, I gently open them to you now. If there are wounds I've learned to carry alone, I invite you into them. If there are prayers I stopped praying, I place them back before you. Meet me here, Lord, in this room, in this season, in this body, in this life. Thank you for not passing me by. Thank you for not forgetting me. Thank you for being closer than I ever realized. I receive your peace. I receive your closeness. I receive you.